Who doesn't like to enjoy a sweet treat during the Halloween season? I know I do. But what happens when you realize the sweet treats you're enjoying are here to kill you? When you realize that sweet tooth you enjoy so much isn't a tooth at all, but a pair of razor-sharp fangs.
Feel the chill in the air. Listen to the leaves rustle as they die and fall to the ground. It is Halloween. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Join me for a tale of Halloween. This is Weekly Spooky.
Hello, my spookies. It's Friday. And because it's October, you know what that means. It's time for some more Spooky in your Weekly as we continue on day 20 of our 31 days of 31 spooky shows to celebrate the spooky season. I'm your host and narrator, Enrique Couto, and we have a nasty little piece of work for you to listen to tonight. This one is about when your candy comes back for revenge, in so many words. And it's by our beloved David O'Hanlon, who yesterday published a full audiobook called Babysitter Massacre: Daddy's Little Killer, which if you haven't listened to, it's worth putting on when you have to kill about 4 hours. And I do mean kill. But before we get to the story, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. There are so many brand new listeners that come to us during the holiday season. And I do mean the Halloween holiday season. If you love what we're doing, please make sure you're subscribed on your favorite podcasting app, because when Halloween ends, we don't. We keep going and going like a demented, haunted Energizer bunny. We'll have a new show for you every single week, no matter what time of year it is. So if you need just a little bit of Halloween to live on and on and on until next October, you're in the right place, and we're happy to have you. And while you're at it, why not leave us a star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts? It helps other spookies join in on the fun. And if you want to support us in a very direct way, you can go to weeklyspooky.com and click on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can make sure the spooky is always on the weekly and beyond, and get a bonus show to thank you for your support. But now, my friends, there's a chill in the air, the leaves are rustling, and the kids, they want to go get their candy. So I think it's about time we start our newest scary story right after these quick words from our sponsors. Sweet Revenge by David O'Hanlon. October 29th, 1999. The nozzle sputtered and sprayed thick ropes of its gooey confection across the men on either side of the conveyor. Hank and Reuben exchanged glances. Hank had gotten the worst of it. Globs of peanut butter-infused molasses soaked through the beard net and glued the mesh to the hair underneath. Reuben laughed at his partner as he tried peeling the garment away. Reuben hit the stop button to remove the clogged nozzle. "I'm gonna have to shave," Hank grumped. "Shelley hates it when I shave." "I don't blame her," Reuben said as he retrieved the pipe wrench. "Seeing half your face is bad enough." "It is pretty ugly." Hank tugged at a gob of candy. "Maybe that's why your mom insists on sitting on it." "Funny, hillbilly." Reuben cranked on the nozzle. "This bitch is really stuck." Hank handed a cheater pipe over the conveyor and Reuben slipped it onto the handle of the wrench for more leverage. The nozzle came loose with ease, promptly spraying warm gunk across Reuben's face. He backpedaled and slipped, falling into the mess. It was Hank's turn to laugh. Reuben tried to throw the pipe at the machine, but the goop on his hands made it impossible. It clattered harmlessly, a foot away. "I hate this job," Reuben huffed. "Nobody even wants the goddamn peanut butter kisses." "They're a staple of Halloween," Hank offered in defense. "Yeah, like STDs are a staple of prom. You might get a few in your sack, but nobody wants them." Reuben peeled himself from the floor and checked the clock. He looked down at the analog counter on the side of the machine and tapped the cover to make sure it wasn't stuck. "Fuck it, that's quota," he said. "We can't work in nasty clothes. Health code, right? We can go change and clean up for the last hour." "Got a razor in your locker?" Hank asked. "I got a Bic, not a brush hog." Reuben gestured at Hank's bushy beard. "What the hell is a razor going to do for that?" "I figure if I shave it off here, I can tell Shelly it got caught in one of the machines. She won't be as angry then." "Good plan." Reuben tried to snap his fingers, but the sticky substance wouldn't allow it. "Cleo! She goes to beauty college. I bet she's got her shit in the car." Hank stared at him inquisitively. "You trust Cleo with sharp objects around your neck?" "Not my neck, but I'd trust her around yours." That was fair. Cleopatra and Reuben had a thing once. Unfortunately, they had different ideas of what that thing was. Reuben's idea involved balling Cleo's cousin. The men shut down their machine and started across the factory. The locker rooms occupied the space beneath the break room in a 2-story structure that looked something like a prison watchtower. Hank used his pocket knife to cut away the beard net while Reuben scrubbed away the residual peanut butter kisses. Hank snickered. It served him right. After all, it was all his fault they'd been stuck on the machine. It shouldn't come as a surprise that the owner of a place called Candy Jack's is a complete degenerate. When Candy Jack heard what had gone down, he quickly assigned Reuben to the worst shit detail in the plant to score points with Cleo. He sent Hank along because he knew Reuben wouldn't leave his partner holding the bag. The plan hadn't worked, but Jack wasn't giving up, so for 3 years the duo had been making peanut butter kisses for Halloween, fruity candy canes for Christmas, and Candy Jack's knockoff Peeps, the appropriately named Cheeps, for Easter. That's how it works in a candy factory. Your rank is based on how much people love or hate the product you're making. Reuben and Hank stood on the bottom rung. Cleo worked on the jacked protein bars in the healthy options department. It was third in the hierarchy of Candyland. Lording over them all were the workers that made the Carson line. Invented by Candy Jack's grandfather, Carson bars came in a number of varieties and were the third most popular candy bar in the country. An entire wing of the factory was dedicated solely to Carsons. Once they were cleaned up enough to look presentable, but still appear to have been working their entire shifts, Hank and Reuben sneaked across the plant to find Cleo. The end of shift whistle blew halfway to her line, so they had to jog to catch her. Cleo came down from the catwalk, stripping the chocolate-spattered vinyl apron off to reveal the curves beneath. Reuben gulped. He knew he screwed up big time, but the closest he'd come to fixing it was getting Cleo to wave at him. It was a step up from the "fuck you" he'd gotten for the first 2 years. Cleo had in fact brought her beauty supplies. Since Reuben had ridden with Hank that afternoon, it meant he couldn't leave until his friend was finished. Cleo knew that too and took her time. She lined up Hank's beard perfectly, then offered to fix his hair. She even threw in a neck and shoulder massage just to keep Reuben from whatever, or whoever, he might have done had he not been stuck pacing the break room for an additional 40 minutes. "Finished," she finally said. Hank checked himself in the mirror and whistled. "I'll be damned." "I've met your wife." "You are," Reuben nodded for the door. "And she's going to be wondering where your ass is. We should hurry up." "Some men can actually be trusted," Cleo whispered as she packed up her stuff. She stared at her hands for a second and grasped her wrist. "Shit. I left my bracelet on deck." She looked out of the break room windows and saw a bank of lights shut off. Unlike Candy Jack, his grandpa had been a great guy. Tucker Carson took care of the employees, including giving them November 1st off so that parents could stay out late trick-or-treating with their kids. In his will, he'd put a clause that it stay that way. With Halloween being Sunday, they were the last shift until Tuesday. "If I go home without that bracelet, my daughter will lose her shit," Cleo said. Another bank of lights clicked off. She sighed. "Will you guys wait for me?" "Of course," Reuben said too quickly. "I mean, I'll wait. Hank has to get home." "I'm your," Hank started. "Best friend," Reuben finished. He jabbed a finger to the door. "Which is why I want you to hurry home before you get in trouble." "Right," Hank winked. "Wouldn't want Shelley grounding me. We have bowling Sunday, the big Halloween tournament." Reuben scowled. He hated bowling and rejected every attempt Hank made to get him to go. His shoulders sagged. "That's right," he agreed. "I wouldn't want to miss out on bowling night." "See you there, partner." Hank whistled as he left the two alone in the break room. Cleo grabbed the bag of styling tools and glared at Reuben. She didn't want to admit she had ever actually liked him, but she had. And 3 years later, she still did. It made her want to punch his stupid, pretty face in. "I know it's normally your line, but I'll be quick," she huffed. Cleo stormed out. Reuben watched her go down the stairs and disappear out of sight. It was going to be a long walk back to his place, but if he could get one step closer to unfucking things between them, it would be worth it. He dragged out one of the plastic chairs and slouched into it. Cleo clambered up the stairwell quickly to her station. She'd forgotten she was wearing the little woven friendship bracelet Tia made her to commemorate starting first grade, and she hadn't had time to run back to her locker. She'd tucked it into the battered metal desk for safekeeping. She set her bag down and opened the desk. Its bent hinges screeched. She slipped the ornament back onto her wrist and closed the desk. "There's no overtime tonight," a man said in a predatory hiss. "Not milking the clock, are you?" Candy Jack leaned on the handrail, pantomiming something other than milking. His hair was slicked back in a platinum pompadour with a goatee dyed to match. All of his suits were gaudy, but the plum number he was wearing then was the worst, with the orange jacket lining and accompanying tie and a black shirt embroidered with tiny, purple lollipops. His exotic leather shoes were something akin to pumpkin guts. He sucked lecherously on a licorice and tried to look suave. Cleo could only think of one thing as Candy Jack blocked her escape: Willy Wonka and the Nose Candy Factory. "I forgot something in my desk." She held up her wrist to show the bracelet. "I'm heading out." Jack seized her arm lightning fast. He stepped close and eyed the jewelry, then let his gaze shift down to the collar of her t-shirt. He pursed his thin lips. "We're starting Carson Christmas trees next week." He didn't bother looking up from her breasts. "That comes with a lot of extra hours. Between school and being a single MILF, you could use more of those." "I make do with what I have." She jerked her hand back and forced a smile. "I'm fine where I'm at. Have a happy Halloween, Mr. Carson." She grabbed her bag and started around him. He cut her off, wagging a finger in the air. "You know you can call me Jack," he said, placing his hands on her shoulders. Cleo clenched the bag tighter. "You know I'm going to call you an ambulance if you don't get your hands off me." "That's cute." Jack stepped back and snickered. "You're cute too. Everyone wants the pink starburst. Every once in a while, you just gotta pop a yellow one in your mouth and suck on it for a while. The taste grows on you. So do genital warts. You don't have to like me, Cleo. I'm not asking you to date me. I'm just saying I have other positions for you." Jack's hands moved to his belt. He hooked his thumb behind the brass buckle and slurped loudly on the licorice. "You should pay more attention to your market research, Jack." She shoved past him. "No one likes the fun-size bars." Her feet left the floor as he slung her back by the hair. The handrail slammed into her back. Her bag hit the deck and spilled out. Jack kicked it out of his path, grabbing her shirt. He spat the licorice into her face. "You could have made this easy." He knelt and grabbed her chin with his free hand. "But I'm glad you didn't." Cleo tried to push his hands away, but Jack slammed her against the railing once more. He pulled his hand back and slapped her, then lifted her to her feet. "My lawyers keep a checkbook ready just to pay off ungrateful bitches like you." He slugged her in the stomach. "Everyone's a victim until they take the hush money. Then they're just whores. I wonder how much you'll end up costing me." "How about a leg?" Cleo gasped. The shears buried into Jack's thigh. He bellowed and stumbled back. Cleo sprang past him and ran down the steps, using the rails to sling herself over the last few. Jack ripped the scissors free and rubbed the puckered wound before chasing after her. Cleo shouted for Reuben, but heard Jack's uneven gait catching up and darted for cover. The whirring of machinery gave her hope of finding help. She moved into the shadows of the equipment and followed the noise. Maybe someone was still shutting down. Cleo ducked behind a half-stacked pallet to look for Jack. His hair glinted in the emergency lighting, letting her know he was still pursuing. She stayed low and crept alongside a melting vat. "Keep running, Cleo!" Jack called out. "It makes it more fun!" Jack's steps were getting closer. Cleo rolled under a conveyor and watched the ugly shoes stop behind her. Blood dripped from the stab wound down on the leather. Jack laughed and started away. Cleo crawled under the line. Old candy bits dug into her hands and knees like thumbtacks, but she forced herself on until she could hear the machine running more clearly. She rolled out from under the conveyor and sprinted up the first set of steps she saw. Large drum mixers lined the platform with another catwalk above them to operate the loading bins. There wasn't anyone there. The hard candy machines had to run continuously to keep the leftovers from seizing up the workings. Fuck! She leaned on the handrail looking for Jack and Reuben in equal measure. Behind her, Candy Jack pulled himself over the railing, silently. Cleo turned in time to see him spring. He tackled her onto the ascending staircase. Her head clanked off the steel steps. Jack opened the shears and slipped a blade into each of her nostrils. The scissors closed slowly, crunching wetly through the gristle of Cleo's septum. She screamed and thrashed beneath them. Jack clenched her jaws and licked the spilling blood from her nose. "You got to stick something in me," he growled. "It's my turn." He punched the scissors through her side, scraping them against the ribs as he wriggled them around, trying to find the lung. She howled in pain, then cursed. Cleo couldn't see him through the tears. Another pained grunt, and his weight came off her. She started clambering up the stairs to get away. Then she heard the voice. "I never liked this fucking job," Reuben said. The thud of a fist meeting flesh punctuated the statement. "More like candy ass, Jack." Cleo tried to clear her vision. She could see the shapes of the two men fighting. Reuben clubbed Jack across the back with both hands. He kicked their boss while he was down. Then he screamed. Jack pulled the scissors from Reuben's foot and stabbed wildly up his leg before scooping him onto his shoulder and dumping him over the guardrail. The snap of bone giving way to concrete was clear even over the noisy equipment. Cleo stumbled up the stairs. Jack ran up them after her. He dived forward and caught her ankle, dropping her to the grated floor. He scrambled to his feet, but Cleo rolled and brought a heel up into his groin. Jack fell against the railing and began undoing his belt while Cleo struggled to stand. He wrapped the garment around his hand. He stepped in and punched her on the injured side. He threw the next one across her jaw. The buckle tore a deep gash. Cleo slumped over the handrail, but kept herself upright. She stared into the swirling, prismatic abyss of molten confection below. "Your wrapper's looking a bit wrinkled, Cleo," Jack hissed. "But the candy is going to be so sweet." He swung another haymaker, and Cleo let herself drop and trip him. Jack flipped over the railing. Cleo sat up, looking him in the eyes. "Nice trick, little treat." He got his foot on the edge. "But I'm still coming to eat you up." "Eat this!" Cleo jerked a lever down. The bin opened and a waterfall of high fructose corn syrup blasted Jack from his perch into the superheated mixture. His skin burned and blistered. Sugar sparkled in the grooves of raw muscle. He screamed until the powerful paddles pulled him under, flooding his lungs and leaving the vat filled with nothing but sweet silence.
More scares to come. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
Halloween 2000. The ball hook left, dropping a single pin before hitting the gutter. Reuben scowled. His injuries had gotten him out of it for a time, but he still owed Hank. He limped back to the bench. "It's the leg," he said. "Throws off my balance." "How long are you going to milk that?" Hank sipped his beer. "I got stabbed 9 times, you dick." Reuben shrugged. "Oh, trust me, I know. You've been bringing it up for a year." Hank took a contemplative swig. "Well, since you came out of the coma anyhow." 9 stab wounds, permanent nerve damage, 11 days in a coma, and Cleo still hadn't given him a second chance. Reuben chugged half his beer. After Candy Jack's death, his second cousin, Delia Carson Fitzpatrick, took over the company. It was renamed the Carson Candy Works, and all the employees got a fat raise, with Reuben being given a sizable settlement and a promotion. So there had been an upside to the entire thing. It just wasn't the payoff Reuben really wanted. The healthiest relationship he'd ever had was banging his math teacher in 10th grade. Naturally, he panicked when things started going good with Cleo. He wasn't ready for a real commitment, or to be a stepdad, so he'd intentionally sabotaged everything. And regretted it for the last 4 years, minus the coma. "It's not too late, Rube," Hank said as if reading his friend's mind. "Probably haven't even left to go trick-or-treating yet." "We're in the middle of a game." "I'm in the middle of a game. You're knocking dust out of the gutters." Hank took Reuben's bottle and finished it in one gulp. "Now you're out of excuses. Go!" "This is illegal." Graham rolled the drum down the ramp and into the grave with the others. "Federal offense level illegal." "Who's going to tell?" Howie gestured across the cemetery. "Unless the EPA has a goddamn seance out here, I think we'll be fine." Howie had managed to convince the pencil pushers at Denoyer Grove Chemical that he was a toxic waste disposal expert. It wasn't too far from the truth, he figured. He'd been working in meth labs since he was 12, after all. Howie wasn't sure what was in the drums, but he was sure it wouldn't matter so far from the town. He'd even had a tombstone made to add legitimacy to the whole thing. It was the most brilliant idea he'd ever had. Another drum rolled down and clanked against the rest. He stared at the battered containers and huffed. "Damn it. They're all jumbled up," he growled. "The dirt has got to go over flat so it don't look conspicuous. Hop down there and stand them up." "You hop down there!" Graham froze, then stood up and craned his neck. "Shit, Howie! Look at that!" Howie turned. A dim, flickering glow came from the far side of the graveyard. Howie cupped a hand to his ear. A voice carried on the crisp fall breeze. He glanced back at the truck. Only one barrel left. They still needed to run the backhoe to cover the grave, or they'd be caught for sure. "I'm going to go over there and see what's going on," Howie said. "Finish up. I'll tell them we're cleaning up after grave robbers. That'll explain the backhoe." "Good idea. The only kind I got." Howie left Graham to finish the hard work while he went to investigate the strange visitor. He could hear the feminine voice more clearly, but that didn't make the words any more familiar. He snuck up alongside an ancient oak for a peek. Black candles burned in a pattern around a grave, and a cloaked figure muttered the words with increasing speed. An electric hum crackled deep in Howie's ears. His skin prickled. The ground throbbed beneath him. The sudden rumble of the backhoe's diesel engine nearly emptied his bowels, and he squealed in surprise. Howie slapped a hand over his mouth and looked over his shoulder. The work lights on the machine were moving as Graham covered the evidence of their crime. He turned back to the arcane memorial service, only to find it was over. The candles were out. The woman was gone. Howie stepped from behind the tree and wandered over. Something crunched beneath his shoe. Then something else. The next thing he stepped on squished. Howie took out his flashlight to look around. Halloween candy was spread within the boundaries of the candles. A darkened patch of empty space lay before him, and he eased to the edge. Inside was a coffin, its lid splintered and broken open. He moved the light up to the gravestone. "I'll be damned," he whispered. "Candy Jack is back," the gravelly voice said behind him. Cleo watched Tia trot excitedly down the driveway lined with giant inflatable pumpkins. They'd hit the afternoon trick-or-treat circuit downtown before going home to touch up the child's costume and down a few chicken nuggets before the real fun began. Tia, dressed as a commando princess, held up the king-sized Reese's with a gap-toothed smile. She'd been self-conscious about losing 4 teeth in 1 week, but the tooth fairy paid up, and it made her costume look more authentic. "The Grubers are giving away the big ones," she squeaked. "They're the best." The Grubers went all out for every holiday. Their Christmas lights even made the must-see list in the Kuto Basin tourist guide, and they were the first stop on every kid's trick-or-treating map. Cleo straightened Tia's lipstick bandolier and smiled. The last week had been a nightmare. Memories of the fight with Jack and his final screams kept her up at night. Her hands shook whenever she picked up her scissors at work. She'd wanted to write off the entire holiday, but pushed through and distracted herself by helping Tia make her costume. It would be worth it. She was still on edge, but seeing how excited the little girl was kept her focused on the moment. "I bet the next house will be a good one too," Tia shouted as she ran away. "Wait up, guys!" Tia disappeared into a gaggle of children as they swarmed along the sidewalk for the next house. Cleo started after them, joining with the other parents trying to keep up with their own kiddos. "Lame," a Power Ranger said as he waddled across the street. He scooped a handful of candy from his bag to show his parents. "What kind of rich people hand out hard candies?" Cleo's mind flashed back to Jack boiling alive in the mixer. She watched the orange-wrapped discs spill from the kid's hand into the street like bits and pieces of her attacker. She wondered if they'd cleaned the machine thoroughly enough to get every particle of Jack out of the candy. Her stomach flipped, and she veered for the sidewalk to vomit behind a row of styrofoam gravestones. The coop chirped as Reuben set the alarm. He'd been too late to catch Cleo at home, so he set out to find her. Everyone knew the best candy was in Argento Hills. Traffic in and out of the gated community was atrocious on Halloween, so Reuben did like most people and found a spot at Cohen Park. Even that had been challenging. He was really doing it. He was going to find Cleo and finally fix things. The nervousness ran straight for his bladder. It could be a while before he caught up with her, so he made a beeline to the restroom. The automatic lights flicked as if they were tired of doing their job too, but finally kicked on, casting the concrete room in a wash of dim, corpse-white illumination. Reuben scrunched his nose at the sight of the urinal. Someone hadn't understood the purpose, apparently. Reuben gagged a little and proceeded to one of the stalls. He closed the door, slipping the bar lock into place. Something tickled his fingertips, and he pulled his hand back reflexively. Ants scurried along the lock in a dedicated formation before disappearing into the neighboring stall. Jesus, this place needs work. He lifted the seat with his shoe. Ugh, and some bleach.
Candy ass.
A voice grumbled. Reuben jumped, almost letting the stream go prematurely. His neighbor didn't say anything else, but the man's voice lingered, haunting him like an old ghost. It was strange and guttural, but he knew it from somewhere. The lights sputtered, Reuben's bladder constricted. The automatic lights had been off when he came in. The stranger with the familiar voice had been hiding in there. Reuben shook it off. He told himself it was just a bum looking for a warm place to sleep. The lights flickered again, and he looked up at them. Reuben's eyes widened. The lights weren't flickering at all. They were covered with millions of sugar ants swarming around the tubes. He stumbled backwards through the door, plowing into the other occupant. His shirt clung to the man as he spun away. He gawked. His mouth moved soundlessly. Reuben cleared his throat. That's some fucking costume. Cracked, multicolored candy scales covered Jack's exposed flesh. The gaudy suit he'd been buried in was stained with expelled embalming fluid and grave dirt. Ants crawled between the candy plates, gnawing at sugary scabs. Jack glared at Reuben, with eyes hard and red-ringed like peppermint discs. He smiled, revealing a row of jagged, rotten teeth.
Thanks, pal,
he growled.
Guess you could say Cleo made it for me.
Candy Jack backhanded him. Reuben slid across the grimy floor and banged into the wall. Jack stood over him, his fingertips ripped as candy spikes grew in place of nails. He stabbed them into Reuben's shoulders and lifted him to his knees. He glanced at the defecation spilling over the brim of the urinal.
Would you look at that?
Jack turned Reuben's face to see.
Remind you of the peanut butter kisses, Rube? Time to get back to work.
He slammed Reuben's face into the bowl of fecal matter. Reuben's legs flailed, his shoes squeaked for traction. Jack stabbed his claws into the man's side, forcing him to inhale more of the filth. Reuben fell still, and Jack stuck him again to make sure, before letting him slump in a lifeless heap. Candy Jack chuckled at the sight of him.
Sorry, Rube.
Jack slipped a licorice rope from his jacket pocket and stuck it in his mouth.
That was a real shitty way to go.
You're not safe yet. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
Kuto Basin was a town with a lot of history. And with history comes tradition. One of the oldest was vandalizing the Swinton home every Halloween since Carl Swinton tried banning the holiday back in '48. The Swintons continued passing the home on from one generation to the next, and likewise the town continued passing on the tradition. Karen Swinton chased 4 delinquents from her yard with a broom as they teepeed her trees. Hank chuckled as he drove by. Those 4 were the distraction. The main attack force swarmed from the bushes and egged the bejesus out of the porch. Hank belched. Beer, hot wings, and candy corn swirled in the confines of the car. He needed to reassess his diet. He lowered the window to get some breathable air. Down the road, he saw the 12-foot-tall inflatable skeleton waving in front of the library. Shelley had worked there since high school, finally becoming the director 3 years prior. On Halloween, she stayed late to read scary stories to the kids. Shelley never liked to drive, especially on the holidays. Hank swung the car into the parking lot and moved his bowling ball to the back seat before putting in the book on tape Shelley had checked out for him. He didn't want to rush her, and the car still needed more time to air out anyhow. Panicked screams broke up the merriment. Cleo sprinted down the sidewalk. Tia was wiping away tears while 2 other kids were still fully engaged in the waterworks. Others clung to each other or the adults that had arrived at the scene first. A teenager in a bloodied clown costume laughed until he fell over and the prop knife clattered on the pavement. His friend, garbed as a victim, chuckled but clearly realized the gag had gone too far as the adults gathered around to confront the children. Cleo grabbed the red nose and jerked the mask off the boy's head. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she shouted. "They're just babies, you asshole!" "Unbunch your fucking panties, lady." The boy snatched the mask from her and stood up. "It was just a joke." "So was your birth." Cleo spun to check on her daughter. "Fuck you, hypocrite," the clown started. "Leave it alone." The other teen grabbed his arm and tried dragging him away. "Suck it, Brian." The clown pulled free. "How'd you spend your Halloween last year?" Cleo bit her lip. "I made the kiddies cry. I'm such a terrible person," Bozo mocked. "At least I'm not a goddamn murderer." Cleo had a fistful of colorful polyester before anyone could stop her. "Want to see how easy it was, you little prick?" "Mommy!" Tia ran to her side, still sniffling. "My bag's almost full. Can we go home?" Cleo uncocked her fist and looked around. The other parents watched silently. Cleo pushed the clown into a hedge, then turned to the other teen. "It was just a joke," she said before taking Tia's hand and walking away. You'd think killing a sleazeball rapist like Jack Carson would make you a town hero. And it mostly had. But there were still others who were more content spreading bullshit theories to paint it differently. He deserved it. Truly Martin shuffled up beside them with her son Warwick in tow. The entire Bryson litter should have been dropped at the pound. Truly had been Tia's babysitter while Cleo worked evenings at the factory. The two had become good friends, but weren't nearly as close as their children had gotten. During the weeks Cleo spent in the hospital, Truly had been the first to step up and take care of the little girl. The extra time at the Martin house had led Tia to declare Warwick her big brother. They'd even made official certificates that hung on each other's walls declaring them siblings for life. "One day I'll be big enough to kick his butt," Warwick whispered loudly as he hugged Tia. "You okay?" Truly asked. "Just ready to go home," Cleo said. It was a long day at the salon, lots of costumes needing special hairdos. "Yours looks great, by the way." "It's a fitting costume, I think." Truly made a show of fluffing her Bo-Peep curls. "Barely fitting," Cleo laughed. "You're a half-inch away from indecent exposure." "I've got 5, maybe 6 more Halloweens before me exposing myself becomes a trick instead of a treat." Truly pushed up her cleavage. "I swear, girl, after 40, the women in my family go from MILF to Mildred." "What's a MILF?" Warwick asked. Hank jumped at the sudden shriek coming from the radio as the DJ came back on the air. He snickered at himself for being so jumpy. Hank glanced at the dash clock. Shelley was taking forever getting the Halloween lights shut off. Their orange glow still sparkled through the frosted glass of the children's library. He looked back at the clock and crushed something on it with his thumb. He clicked on the dome light to examine the kill mashed onto the digit. A little black sugar ant. Another toppled out of the heater vent, letting the blast of air push it in a spin that landed it next to the gear shift. Hank ignored it. He always banged on the hood when the nights got cooler to make sure no stray cats were looking for a warm spot to sleep. He'd never considered bugs might do the same. Hank got out of the car, but left it running for the 6-legged hitchhiker. He walked up to the sidewalk in the dim illumination of the street lamps. The city spent a lot on the library, but never seemed to have enough left over to replace the bulbs in the parking lot. A long crack in the concrete caught his eye. He didn't remember it, and it was too damn big to have not been noticed. He knelt to inspect it. The crack moved away from his probing fingers. His eyes followed the long line of ants to the front door of the library. Hank jerked upright. "Shelley!" He ran to the doors and jerked them open. "Shelley, we need to go!" Hank didn't know why the ants terrified him. He didn't have a problem with bugs in general, but ants were the puppies of the insect world as far as he was concerned. Yet, there he was in a full-blown, bowel-shaking terror over the critters. He darted through the library to the children's reading room. The wooden doors were ajar, halting him in his tracks. "Shelley! Where are you, honey?" He stepped hesitantly into the room and got his answer. Her bulging, bloodshot eyes stared at him from a blue face. Her tongue lolled from her mouth. The strand of orange lights blinked festively around her neck. Hank ran to her and tried to lift her up. She slipped in his arms and he saw the puncture wounds still oozing from her Victorian dress. Her ruffled sleeves ended at ragged stumps. "You're gonna be all right," Hank said. "I'm gonna get you down. You're gonna be all right, honey."
That's a funny one.
Jack stepped out of the shadows, clapping with Shelley's severed hands.
Sorry for the terrible applause. They're second-hand.
Hank roared and charged. Candy Jack leapt away, letting him barrel into the drywall. Jack discarded the appendages over his shoulders. Hank collected himself and attacked again. Jack ducked a haymaker and lashed out at Hank's belly. Intestines spilled at the man's feet. Jack backed away, chuckling. He wiggled his fingers to show his claws.
Damn strange thing, isn't it?
Jack sucked the viscera from one and moaned.
They each have their own flavor, even.
Jack stabbed the talon under Hank's jaw until it came through his tongue.
What's that taste like to you?
He asked.
Despair? Death? Blue raspberry? Your bitch fought harder than you.
Hank swung his arms up and gripped Jack's throat. "I'm not finished yet." He forced himself to stand, letting his guts empty into a pile as he strangled the candy-coated killer. Hank charged forward. His boots slipped in his own insides, but he kept driving Jack back. He wanted Shelley to see when he popped the monster's head off. All his strength surged into his hands as they tightened. Candy scales cracked and sliced into his palms. Jack jerked his finger from Hank's chin and plunged the claws into his chest. The chokehold didn't release. Jack twisted his fist. Hank stumbled. His grip loosened. Jack tore Hank's beating heart from his ribcage. Hank's hand slipped from Jack's neck as he fell.
Haven't you heard, fat boy?
Jack held up the organ.
Carbs'll kill you.
Are you afraid? Good. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
The candy spilled from the pumpkin bucket onto the coffee table. It wasn't a great haul, not like the previous years, and Cleo felt bad about it. If she hadn't lost her shit on that punk, they'd have stayed out longer. Tia was excited nonetheless. All her favorites were in the mix, and even better, there was a pack of Dunkaroos. Those were Warwick's favorites, so she quickly set them aside to give him the next day at school. She picked out a 3-pack of Whoppers, dangling them by the paper. "I'll trade you these if I can stay up late," she negotiated. "You're already up late, goober." Cleo leaned over and smudged the pink and purple camo on her daughter's cheeks. "And you still need a bath. Go get washed up and you can stay up for one scary movie. Not too scary, though?" "Deal." Cleo snatched the malt balls and leaned back on the couch. "Hurry up and make sure to wash your face really good." Tia scampered down the hall. Cleo tore the wrapper with her teeth and popped one of the candies into her mouth. She rolled it around with her tongue. If Tia hadn't stopped her, she'd be spending the next few Halloweens in jail for assaulting a minor. She might have killed Jack a year before, but he was still chasing her. Every day she dealt with him again. If the meds worked, Maybe she didn't dream about him as often, but she still jumped whenever someone touched her. Still slept with the lights on, still kept a gun in her nightstand, still puked at the sight of a Carson bar. Every day, she faced Jack again, just like she had in the factory that night. Only she hadn't faced him alone then. She went into the kitchen. The bathtub started running. That would give her time to do what she should have done months before. She took the phone from the wall and dialed Ruben's number. She hated that it was so easy for her to remember it. The line rang 9 times before the answering machine picked up. She wasn't going to leave a message, but she didn't hang up either. Hearing his voice was strangely calming. When the machine beeped, she ended the call and returned the phone to the receiver. "Of course you're not home, shithead," she muttered. Or maybe I'm just a loser. It's the last Halloween of the millennium, and I'm home by 9:30. Cleo stared at the phone, willing it to ring. Maybe he was home and saw her name on caller ID. He'd call her right back. It didn't ring. She reached for it to try again and pulled her hand away as if the phone were searing hot. He'd see she'd called twice. How would that look? Maybe he was too scared to try again, or maybe he'd moved on after years of getting the cold shoulder. He'd almost died saving her, and she sent him a get-well-soon card. There was enough to process after what happened that she couldn't bring herself to explain it all to the man that broke her heart. Cleo went to the fridge and pulled a soda from the plastic rings. She paced the linoleum. The phone rang and she sat the can on the table, sloshing some out in her rush to answer. "Ruben?" she asked. "Ew, no," Truly said. "I know it's a rough night, but it's never take back an ex rough, girl. I just wanted to make sure you two got home safe." "Yeah, true. We made it just fine." Cleo let her head bang against the door jamb. "It is a rough night." "You got no idea, Cleo," Truly said, keeping her voice low. "What do you mean?" There was a long pause before Truly could bring herself to answer. Shelley Rudolph was murdered at the library. Her husband, too. Dan just called from the station. It's bad. Like Manson family kind of bad. "Hank? They killed Hank, too?" Cleo stiffened. "Did Dan say anything else?" "No," Truly sighed. "He just said it was terrible. Why don't you two come over here? It'd be better for you tonight anyhow. Even if this hadn't happened, I really don't want to be alone tonight either." Tia's in the bath right now. Cleo tried to control her breathing. She wanted to call Ruben even more. She needed to make sure he hadn't been with Hank. "I'll call you in a bit." She hung up before Truly could protest and went to sit at the dining table. She started dialing Ruben's number again when she spotted the ant on the rim of her soda can. A few more lapped at the edges of spilled drops. Gross. Cleo took the can to the sink and poured it out. She watched it going down the drain. "Oh, look, it's like my sanity," she mumbled. She went down the hall to check on Tia. She could hear the child singing "Free Your Mind" through the bathroom door. She smiled and went to their rooms, turning on the lights in both before going to her bedside table for her .38 Special Ruger. She set the revolver on the bed while she changed into her pajamas. Her gym bag caught her eye. Dan was one of Kuto Basin's 7 detectives. Truly would be alone all night and probably into the morning with a murderer on the loose. Cleo chewed her lip thoughtfully. She decided to try Ruben one more time before going over. Cleo went into the living room to get another Whopper from the pack. She popped it into her mouth and immediately spat it out. Ants crawled out of the packaging, running across her fingertips. She threw the candy and slapped the bugs away. Great. Now I have ants to deal with. She glared at the package she'd tossed. That's not going to help matters. Cleo went and picked up the candy. As she stood, she saw the chain lock dangling. Her gaze drifted to the 2 deadbolts. She'd forgotten to lock both of them for the first time since she had them installed. She corrected the mistake, clicking each into place and then securing the chain too. She stormed into the kitchen, dropping the last malt ball in the trash bin.
Good idea.
Jack decked her across the jaw as she turned.
Sugar'll give you toothaches.
Cleo propped herself against the countertop. How? What? No!
I don't quite understand it either.
Candy Jack spun in place.
But here I am, looking sweeter than ever.
He sprang across the room, pinning her between him and the Formica. He spread his fingers in the air, letting the light shimmer inside the translucent talons. He dragged their points along Cleo's cheek before settling his hand on her throat. He gave a squeeze. Cleo tried to scream, but he tightened his grasp, turning it into a squeak.
I'm going to give you the sugar-frosted fuck of your life, little treat.
He licked the scar on her chin, leaving a sticky trail over the raised flesh.
Don't worry, I'll pull out. Don't want any Sour Patch Kids running around. Could you imagine that? Think they'd look like their daddy?
Jack clicked his claws against the candy scales of his face. He ground against her thigh. Cleo brought her knee into his groin. Jack staggered back, clutching himself.
Ow! Right in the milk duds!
He groaned. Cleo wrenched the carving knife from the wooden block. She slashed repeatedly in an X pattern. Candy chips flew from bloodless wounds on his face. Jack brought his arms up, and the knife sliced through the bright orange sleeves of his jacket. The blade clinked against the scales underneath. She thrust under his guard. The knife flexed and skittered off his chest. Jack's forearm slammed into her face.
You can't stop me, Cleo. I've been snorting pixie sticks and chugging Surge since I crawled out of that grave you put me in.
He tore open his shirt, revealing a torso covered in thick scales and wrinkled scar tissue between where his flesh had burned in the mixing vat.
I'm an armor-plated, high-calorie, supernatural killing machine, baby. Now, give me some sugar.
He lunged forward and Cleo dived under his arms, rolling across the floor to safety. Spiked maltodextrin missiles splintered the doorframe. Cleo screamed and grasped the one that had gone through her shoulder, pinning her to the jamb. Jack looked quizzically at his fingers as new talons grew in place of the old ones.
I didn't even know I could do that.
He smiled malevolently. Cleo pulled herself off the spear and crawled into the living room.
You know running doesn't work, Cleo, and no one's coming to save you this time. I've made sure of that.
Candy Jack stalked her down the hallway. He paused by the bathroom door and listened to the child singing. He dragged a claw down the wood, tearing a deep furrow.
It isn't Halloween if the kiddies don't get some candy.
He hissed. Leave her alone!
For now,
Jack agreed.
If you satisfy my sweet tooth.
Blood spurted from the wound as Cleo pressed herself up from the floor. She fell against the bedroom door and toppled through it. Jack threw himself onto her before she could recover.
Don't get up. That's my job. And as you can tell, I'm very hard at work.
He pressed his hips against her ass.
Ironic, isn't it? You're about to give the candy your cavities.
Jack twisted Cleo's hair around his hand and dragged her up to bend her over the bed. Mommy? Tia came around the doorway. Get away from my mommy! Run, Tia! Cleo shouted. But it was too late. The child charged into the room and beat her fists on Jack's back.
Wait your turn.
He swung around, slashing her across the abdomen.
I'll unwrap you next.
Jack lifted Tia by the jaw and slammed her onto the bed. He jerked his head around to see the revolver bounce up from the mattress. Cleo jerked away, leaving a fistful of hair in Jack's sticky fingers. She stretched out her hand for the falling pistol. Jack pounced on her as she hit the floor. The blue steel broke his teeth and the barrel punched into his palate. Suck on it, Jack. Cleo thumbed back the hammer. The taste grows on you. The back of Jack's head came apart like a busted piñata. An iridescent slime dripped down the wall and confectionery shrapnel scattered all over the floor. Jack slumped over. Tia crawled across the bed, hugging her mom's side. Cleo scraped up a handful of brain matter. Smarties. She dumped them onto Jack's corpse. Of course they are. Was he a monster? The child whispered. Always, Cleo answered. The scales on Jack's chest began to move. Some ground noisily against one another. Others fractured. Cleo aimed at his heart, preparing to fire again. The ants scuttled around the seams where the flesh met candy plating. Scar tissue pulsed, then erupted with black lava across Jack's body. Cleo gasped and jumped back. She picked Tia up, keeping the weapon aimed at Jack. The corpse disappeared beneath the insects. Cleo backed them out of the room, unable to keep her eyes off the buffet. The body was already breaking down and collapsing in on itself. Cleo stuffed the revolver into her waistband. There wouldn't be anything left when they were finished. She closed the door so the ants could dine in peace. Candy Jack wouldn't come back again. Sorry, caught me with a mouthful of candy corn. Hope you enjoyed that story as much as I did. The twisted mind of David O'Hanlon never disappoints, and you may have noticed a familiar name in there. Kuto Basin. Apparently that's a new city that David's playing around with, here exclusively, for Weekly Spooky, and I couldn't be more flattered. Thanks a lot, David, for making me a part of your depraved, joyous story time. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to let me know, why not send me an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. I'm always happy to hear from any and all of you. Or you can even join us on Facebook at Weekly Spooky's Tomb of Terror. Just type that into the search bar. Join us as we share scary stories, strange news articles, but mostly very fun and odd memes. And if you want to hear even more from David O'Hanlon, make sure to come back next Thursday for another full audiobook from the Babysitter Massacre series that I know will leave you hungry for more. Now I want to take a quick moment to thank our Patreon podcast boosters. These are folks who pay just a little bit more to hear their names at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, Bobbletopia.com, Megan Hua, Julia Kirsch, Brent McCullough, Steve King, Karen Weemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you so much. And if you want to hear your name on every single episode of Weekly Spooky, just go to weeklyspooky.com, click on Patreon, and select any tier at $15 or higher. But as little as $1 gets you an exclusive show every single month. Well, my friends, it's time for me to get back to work. Tomorrow, we have a special episode of Cutting Deep into Horror, where we're going to talk about the Halloween favorite, Murder Party. And I don't want you to miss it, so make sure you're subscribed and I'll see you tomorrow. So for now, for myself, for my executive producers Joshua Butler and Rob Fields, for my producer Dan Wilder and our composer Ray Mattis, I will talk at you tomorrow.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you are safe. Trust me.